August 5th, 2026. Right now, off the southern coast of the Philippines, the same stretch of ocean floor that produced this year's most powerful earthquake just moved again. A magnitude 6.3 earthquake struck this Wednesday, roughly 20 miles southwest of Sarangani Island, sending millions of people across Mindanao into the streets in panic. No tsunami warning was issued this time, and early reports show no casualties or major damage. But this earthquake didn't happen in isolation. It struck along the exact same Cotabato Trench that unleashed a devastating magnitude 7.8 earthquake just 2 months ago, the largest the Philippines has experienced in half a century. An event that killed at least 41 people, injured hundreds more, and physically lifted parts of the seafloor by nearly 2 meters. So today we're breaking down exactly what happened this Wednesday, how it connects to that catastrophic June earthquake, the actual mechanics of why this specific stretch of ocean floor keeps producing major earthquakes, what scientists studying this specific fault system are now warning could happen next, and why millions of people living across this stretch of the southern Philippines are living with genuinely elevated risk right now, not because of panic or speculation, but because of actual published seismological stress analysis. Before we get into it, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap that bell icon so you get notified the moment this situation develops further, because this specific fault system has already proven capable of producing far more than a magnitude 6.3. Drop a comment right now. If you're anywhere in Mindanao, or if you were affected by the earthquake back in June, tell me what today felt like compared to that larger event. Did it bring back memories, or did it feel like a completely separate experience? I want to hear directly from people who've actually lived through both of these. Now let's get into exactly what happened today. At 12:14 in the afternoon local time on Wednesday, a magnitude 6.3 earthquake struck approximately 32 kilometers, close to 20 miles, southwest of the small island of Sarangani, according to the United States Geological Survey. The quake occurred at a depth of 62 kilometers, a moderately deep rupture that helped limit the intensity of shaking felt at the surface compared to what a shallower earthquake of the same magnitude would have produced. No tsunami warning was issued following this particular event, and as of the most current reporting, there have been no immediate reports of casualties or significant damage. Given the timing and location, though, the human story behind this earthquake carries a genuinely striking detail. A rescuer on Sarangani Island, Harley Soro, described the scene to reporters directly, explaining that the earthquake struck at almost the exact moment a large crowd of residents had gathered specifically to receive a government financial subsidy. The shaking was strong enough that people ran and shouted in panic, exactly the kind of chaotic, frightening scene you'd expect when a sudden, powerful earthquake strikes a densely gathered crowd with no warning. Fortunately, according to Soro's own assessment on the ground, everyone at that gathering was accounted for and safe, with preliminary indications suggesting the event, on its own, likely won't produce significant casualties or damage. That's the immediate story of today's earthquake, and on its own, it would be a notable but not extraordinary event for a country that experiences seismic activity as routinely as the Philippines does. The Philippines sits directly within the Pacific Ring of Fire, the horseshoe-shaped arc of intense tectonic activity that stretches from the western coast of the Americas, across Japan, and down through Southeast Asia, and earthquakes are close to a near-daily occurrence across the archipelago as a direct result. But understanding why this particular magnitude 6.3 earthquake deserves closer attention than a typical moderate quake requires looking directly at what happened in this exact same stretch of ocean just 2 months earlier, because the connection between these two events is genuinely significant, and it's exactly the kind of pattern seismologists watch most closely. On June 8, 2026, at 7:37 in the morning local time, a magnitude 7.8 earthquake ruptured offshore, with its epicenter located just 32 kilometers west of Masim, Sarangani, at an estimated depth of 33 kilometers. This was, according to the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, known by its acronym PHIVOLCS, the largest earthquake to strike the Philippines in half a century. The shaking lasted approximately 30 seconds, and the Philippine Seismic Network recorded a maximum intensity of 8 on the modified Mercalli intensity scale in the hardest hit areas, a level of shaking intensity capable of causing considerable damage to ordinarily constructed buildings and toppling structures not specifically engineered to withstand major seismic force. The quake struck with particularly cruel timing, hitting on the very first day of the new school year for the 2026 to 2027 academic calendar, meaning the earthquake's violent shaking coincided with schools across the region being packed with students on their opening day, and video and reporting from the time described the air filled with the screams and cries of terrified students as buildings shook around them. The human toll from that June earthquake was severe. Confirmed reports put the death toll at a minimum of 41 people, with more than 480 injured, though officials cautioned at the time that these figures were still being verified and could be revised as search and damage assessment efforts continued. Buildings toppled across the region, including at least one structure at Notre Dame of Dadiangas University in General Santos City that partially collapsed. In South Cotabato Province specifically, the seismic shaking cracked numerous roads and caused a vital bridge in the town of Banga to collapse entirely, forcing authorities to close a major highway stretch running from Taboli to General Santos, following a partial roadway collapse elsewhere along that same route. Essential utilities, including internet, electricity, and water service, faced widespread disruption across Coronadal and the surrounding communities, complicating both the immediate emergency response and the longer recovery effort that followed in the weeks after the main shock. The quake also generated a tsunami, with waves reaching as high as 1.4 meters recorded along the affected coastline, and in one of the more visually striking physical consequences of the rupture, the shifting of the seafloor along the Cotabato Trench actually raised sections of the seabed by as much as 2 meters, physically exposing coral reefs that had previously been submerged and causing direct harm to the marine ecosystems in the immediate area. A genuinely dramatic, tangible illustration of just how much physical ground displacement a magnitude 7.8 earthquake is capable of producing along an active subduction zone. In the hours immediately following the main shock, FIVOX recorded a staggering 138 separate aftershocks, ranging from magnitude 1.3 all the way up to a significant magnitude 6.7 secondary quake, with officials warning at the time that aftershock activity could realistically continue for several days to several weeks following the initial rupture. Given that today's magnitude 6.3 earthquake struck nearly 2 full months after the original main shock, it's worth understanding whether it genuinely qualifies as a continuation of that original aftershock sequence, or represents a separate, independent rupture along the same broader fault system. Seismologists generally classify aftershock sequences as capable of producing significant felt earthquakes for weeks, months, or in some cases even years following an especially large main shock, with the frequency of aftershocks gradually declining over time following a well-documented statistical pattern, rather than stopping abruptly at any fixed cutoff point. A magnitude 6.3 earthquake occurring 2 months after a magnitude 7.8 main shock, in essentially the same location, sits well within the range of behavior seismologists would expect from a continuing, gradually decaying aftershock sequence, particularly for a main shock as large and energetic as June's event. To understand why this specific stretch of ocean floor has produced such a sustained sequence of significant earthquakes, you need to understand the underlying geology driving all of this activity. And it's genuinely one of the more structurally complex and seismically hazardous regions anywhere on the planet. Mindanao sits directly across the convergent boundary between 2 major tectonic plates, the Sunda Plate and the Philippine Sea Plate, and the island itself is squeezed between 2 opposing subduction zones, the Cotabato Trench running along its western coast and the Philippine Trench skirting its eastern coastline, with the Philippine fault system running through the middle of the island between them. The Cotabato Trench specifically, the fault system responsible for both June's catastrophic magnitude 7.8 earthquake and today's magnitude 6.3 event, is a subduction zone where oceanic crust from the Sunda Plate, sitting beneath the Celebes Sea, is gradually forced downward beneath the Philippines Mobile Belt, the broader block of crust that Mindanao and the surrounding islands sit on top of. It's worth understanding briefly what subduction actually means mechanically, because it's the underlying driver of essentially every major earthquake covered in this story. As one tectonic plate is forced beneath a neighboring plate along a subduction zone, friction along the boundary between the 2 plates locks them together at the surface, even as the deeper plate material continues moving downward and forward. That locked section accumulates enormous stored elastic stress over years, decades, or centuries. Exactly the same underlying mechanism responsible for major earthquakes along subduction zones worldwide, from Japan's own trench systems to the Pacific Northwest's Cascadia subduction zone. When the accumulated stress along a locked section of a subduction zone finally exceeds the friction holding it in place, the fault suddenly slips, releasing that stored energy all at once as an earthquake, with larger locked sections capable of releasing correspondingly larger, more energetic earthquakes when they finally rupture. This isn't a simple single fault line either. FIVOX has specifically noted that the Cotabato Trench works alongside several nearby active local faults, some of which remain hidden beneath more recent sediment deposits and haven't been fully mapped, all of which are capable of generating earthquakes ranging from minor tremors to genuinely catastrophic great magnitude events. According to FIVOX's own detailed earthquake primer, Sarangani and the surrounding provinces have experienced at least 7 significant earthquakes ranging from magnitude 5.7 to magnitude 8.0 between 1917 and 2023 alone, based on historical seismic records, with the most recent damaging earthquake prior to this year's sequence being a magnitude 6.8 event that struck on November 17, 2023. This is exactly where the scientific analysis genuinely worth understanding comes into focus, because it's not just historical background. It's an active, published area of concern among earthquake scientists studying this specific region right now. Ross Stein of Temblor, working alongside Shinji Toda of Tohoku University, published a detailed stress transfer analysis of the June 2026 magnitude 7.8 main shock, examining exactly how that earthquake's rupture may have redistributed physical stress along the surrounding sections of the Cotabato Trench. Their analysis identified something genuinely significant: a roughly 100-kilometer-long section of the trench sitting between the location of this year's magnitude 7.8 earthquake and a previous magnitude 7.5 event that struck the same broader fault system back in 2023, a segment their research suggests may now be closer to failure as a direct result of the June main shock redistributing stress onto it. In plain terms, when a major earthquake ruptures one section of a fault system, it doesn't just release the stress that had built up along that specific segment. It can also transfer additional stress onto neighboring, still locked sections of the same fault, effectively pushing those adjacent segments closer to their own breaking point, even though they haven't ruptured yet themselves. That's precisely the mechanism Stein and Toda's published analysis is specifically flagging as a genuine, ongoing concern for this particular stretch of the Cotabato Trench. And it's worth noting that their analysis also raises the possibility that the southernmost Mindanao fault, a separate but nearby structure, could similarly have been brought closer to failure by the same main shock, adding another dimension of uncertainty to exactly which specific fault segment might be the next to release accumulated stress. Adding another layer to that concern, the same research specifically notes that vigorous earthquake swarms, meaning clusters of numerous smaller earthquakes occurring close together in time and location, have already been recorded along the Cotabato Trench in the recent past, including the Palembang earthquake swarm that began back in 2025 and the more recent Calamansig earthquake swarm that began this year, both occurring in the same general region as the fault segment researchers have flagged as potentially loaded with additional stress following June's main shock. Today's magnitude 6.3 earthquake, striking in almost the exact same location as June's devastating magnitude 7.8 event, fits directly into this pattern of continued, active seismic behavior along a fault system that scientists have specifically identified as carrying elevated risk right now, rather than representing an isolated, unrelated tremor. It's worth stepping back and being precise about what this stress transfer research does and doesn't tell us, because this is exactly the kind of nuanced scientific finding that's easy to either dismiss too quickly or overstate into unwarranted panic. This kind of published stress analysis identifies a section of fault that carries elevated probability of rupturing based on the physical redistribution of stress following a nearby major earthquake. It does not, and cannot, predict exactly when that rupture might occur, whether that's within days, months, or years, nor can it guarantee with certainty that the flagged segment will rupture at all, rather than gradually releasing that additional stress through a longer series of smaller, less destructive earthquakes instead, potentially including exactly the kind of moderate event that occurred today. What it does provide is a scientifically grounded reason for continued close monitoring of this specific stretch of the Cotabato Trench. Exactly the kind of monitoring 5ALX is actively conducting through its network of 128 seismic stations positioned across the Philippines, including dedicated, staff-controlled stations specifically covering General Santos City, Kidapawan City, and Cotabato City, along with the broader 5ALX Mindanao Cluster Monitoring Center for Earthquake and Tsunami, based in Davao City, specifically tasked with tracking seismic activity across this entire region around the clock. It's also worth understanding the deeper historical context behind why this specific trench commands so much scientific and public attention. Because the Cotabato Trench has produced genuinely catastrophic earthquakes within relatively recent memory, well before this year's sequence of events. Back in 1976, a magnitude 8.0 earthquake struck along this same trench system, generating a devastating tsunami that ultimately killed approximately 8,000 people, a disaster that remains one of the deadliest natural catastrophes in the Philippines' modern history. That single historical data point puts this year's magnitude 7.8 event, as catastrophic and deadly as it genuinely was, into a broader perspective. This specific fault system has demonstrated, within living historical memory, that it's capable of producing earthquakes considerably larger and more destructive than even June's main shock, a sobering reminder embedded directly in the region's own seismic record, and precisely the kind of historical precedent that keeps this specific trench under such close, sustained scientific scrutiny, even during quieter periods between major events. Looking at the recent pattern of significant earthquakes striking Mindanao specifically helps illustrate just how seismically active this broader region has become over just the past few years. In December of 2023, a magnitude 7.6 earthquake struck the Mindanao region. Less than 2 years later, in October of 2025, a magnitude 7.4 event occurred approximately 260 kilometers to the northeast of this year's activity. Then came June's magnitude 7.8 main shock, which released considerably more seismic energy than either of those two preceding events, according to detailed hazard analysis conducted following the earthquake. And now, just 2 months later, today's magnitude 6.3 earthquake continues that same pattern of significant, closely spaced seismic activity across this specific stretch of the southern Philippines. Taken together, this represents a genuinely active, ongoing period of major seismic activity across Mindanao, not a single isolated disaster followed by a return to quiet background conditions. It's worth touching briefly on what recovery has actually looked like across the affected region in the 2 months since June's main shock, because that context matters directly for understanding why continued seismic activity in this same area carries such genuine, compounding concern for the communities involved. Rebuilding critical infrastructure like the collapsed bridge in Banga and the damaged highway stretch between Taboli and General Santos takes considerably longer than the initial emergency response phase, often stretching across many months or longer, depending on the scale of the damage and the resources available for reconstruction. Communities working through that kind of extended rebuilding process are particularly vulnerable to any additional seismic activity in the same region, both because temporary repairs or partially reconstructed infrastructure may not yet meet the same structural standards as the original construction, and because the psychological toll of continued aftershocks and follow-on earthquakes, exactly like today's magnitude 6.3 event, can be genuinely significant for residents who are still actively working through the recovery process from an earlier, larger disaster. That combination of ongoing physical rebuilding and continued active seismic risk is precisely why today's earthquake, even without producing significant new casualties or damage on its own, represents a genuinely stressful and consequential event for communities across Sarangani and the broader Mindanao region. Given everything covered so far, here's the honest, complete picture of where things stand as of today. This Wednesday's magnitude 6.3 earthquake, on its own, appears to have caused minimal direct harm, striking with enough force to send crowds into genuine panic, but, based on the earliest available reporting, without producing significant casualties or structural damage. But this earthquake didn't occur in isolation. It struck along the exact same Cotabato trench system responsible for June's catastrophic magnitude 7.8 main shock, a fault system that published seismological research has specifically identified as carrying a segment potentially loaded with additional stress following that main shock, sitting between June's rupture and a previous 2023 earthquake along the same trench. Combined with a documented history of active earthquake swarms in the immediate region over the past 2 years, and a broader historical record including a catastrophic magnitude 8.0 tsunami-generating earthquake along this exact trench back in 1976, this represents a region of genuinely elevated, scientifically documented seismic risk, actively being monitored in real time by FIVOLX's extensive seismic network, rather than a story that concluded once June's initial disaster response wound down. So here's what's actually worth knowing and doing if you live in Mindanao, particularly across Sarangani, South Cotabato, and the broader General Santos City area, or if you have family and connections in this specific region of the Philippines. Follow PHI-VOLCS's official earthquake bulletins and advisories directly for the most current, authoritative information on aftershock activity and any changes to the broader seismic hazard assessment for this region, since they maintain continuous, real-time monitoring across their full network of seismic stations specifically covering this area, and their public bulletins remain the single most reliable source of accurate, up-to-date information rather than secondhand social media reports. If your home, school, or workplace sustained any structural damage during June's magnitude 7.8 earthquake that wasn't fully repaired or professionally inspected afterward, treat that as a genuine, ongoing safety priority given the continued significant seismic activity in this same region, since a structure weakened by one major earthquake can be considerably more vulnerable to collapse during a subsequent, even moderate earthquake like today's magnitude 6.3 event. Know the safest place to shelter in whatever building you're in at any given moment, generally under sturdy furniture and away from windows and exterior walls, and have that response essentially automatic, given how frequently significant earthquakes have struck this specific region over recent months. If you live anywhere along the coastline within reach of the Cotabato Trench, know your evacuation route to higher ground in case a tsunami warning is ever issued, exactly as happened following June's main shock, since shallow, powerful earthquakes along this trench have historically demonstrated the ability to generate genuinely dangerous tsunami waves, both in June's more recent event and far more catastrophically back in 1976. Keep a basic emergency kit accessible at home and, if practical, at your workplace or your children's school, including water, a flashlight, any necessary medications, and a way to charge your phone, even without grid power, given how thoroughly utilities were disrupted across Coronadal and the surrounding communities following June's earthquake. Have a communication plan with family members that doesn't rely entirely on phone calls going through, since overloaded cell networks are consistently one of the first things to fail in the immediate aftermath of any significant seismic event in this region. And if you're specifically in an area near where public gatherings or events regularly take place, exactly the kind of scenario that put today's earthquake in such sharp, frightening focus given it struck during a crowded government subsidy distribution event, it's worth thinking in advance about where you'd move and how you'd help others around you if shaking begins during a similarly crowded public gathering, since crowd panic itself, separate from any structural collapse, can become a genuine secondary hazard during a sudden, powerful earthquake, particularly in tightly packed outdoor or indoor gathering spaces without clearly marked, easily accessible open areas nearby. If you're a parent with children currently back in school following June's disrupted start to the academic year, it's worth confirming directly with your child's school what their specific earthquake response protocol looks like, given that the original main shock struck on literally the first day of classes, and ask whether the school building itself has been formally inspected and cleared following that earthquake, particularly if you noticed any visible cracking or structural concerns in the immediate aftermath that may not have been fully addressed. And more broadly, for anyone in this region simply trying to process the psychological weight of living through a second significant earthquake within the same 2-month window, it's worth recognizing that heightened anxiety following a pattern like this is a completely normal, expected response, not an overreaction, and that continuing to follow official guidance and maintaining practical preparedness measures is a genuinely constructive way to manage that anxiety rather than letting it become paralyzing. Stepping back from the immediate details of today's earthquake, here's the piece of this story worth genuinely sitting with as this broader sequence continues to unfold. What happened this Wednesday isn't a standalone, disconnected earthquake. It's the latest entry in an active, ongoing period of significant seismic activity along the Cotabato Trench, a fault system that produced the Philippines' largest earthquake in half a century just 2 months ago, that published scientific stress transfer research has specifically flagged as carrying elevated risk along a particular segment sitting close to today's epicenter. And that carries a documented historical record, including a catastrophic, tsunami-generating magnitude 8.0 earthquake back in 1976 that killed approximately 8,000 people. Millions of people across Mindanao live directly within reach of this fault system's potential impact, which is exactly why every significant tremor along this trench, including today's magnitude 6.3 event, continues to be tracked so closely by both 5AUX's monitoring network and the broader international seismological community, studying exactly how this specific, still active sequence of earthquakes might continue to unfold in the weeks and months ahead. We'll keep tracking the situation closely as it develops. Any further significant aftershocks or new earthquakes along the Cotabato Trench, updates on the recovery and rebuilding efforts still underway across South Cotabato and General Santos City following June's devastating main shock, and any further scientific analysis of exactly how much additional stress may still be loaded onto the segments of this fault system that haven't yet ruptured. Subscribe and hit that bell icon right now so you don't miss those updates, because given this trench's own recent history and the specific scientific concerns already published about it, this almost certainly won't be the last significant earthquake we're covering out of this exact region. And drop that comment below if you haven't yet. Tell me whether today's earthquake, striking in nearly the same spot as June's disaster, changes how you think about the ongoing risk facing communities across Mindanao, or whether the absence of casualties this time offers you any genuine reassurance. See you in the next one.